Hello, everyone. How are you? Wow, it is. I can't see your faces. Here we go. Hi. Good morning. I love that waving. As you just heard, I'm here to talk to you about CSS Houdini. But I wanted to sort of dive deeper and talk about how we can use it today, how we can use some of those features in browsers today while we wait for that implementation. So I started thinking about this talk as being more like progressively enhancing Houdini features today. And so that's the attitude I came into this with. And then I quickly realized that this talk became CSS Houdini, oh my gosh, it's super cool, but not as progressively enhanceable as I thought it was today. Because Houdini gives you a lot of great browser features that just don't exist in browsers now, and it lets us interact with browsers differently. In the end, there are a lot of ways that we can do some of these things. There are lots of things that we can do to make it progressively and enhanceable and fall back nicely. So this talk in the end has become CSS Houdini, super cool and definitely worth exploring today. Here's a little bit about me. I work as a developer advocate for material design on the web. I also do little mnemonic devices, little doodles called dev doodles. I put those on Instagram. I have a podcast about tech tools, tips, and tricks called Tuesday, every other Tuesday at 2. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can find me on Twitter at Una. That's also my GitHub, CodePen, all the things. So please like and subscribe. Thank you. So, Houdini. It's a really exciting technology. I didn't see before who said that they've heard of Houdini. I see maybe 25% of the audience, maybe 30% of the audience, which is great because it's still super new. It's still a little up and coming. But for those of you who don't know what Houdini is a low-level API for CSS. Now, what does that mean? Previously, if you wanted to style anything on the browser that doesn't currently exist in CSS as a property value pair, you have to write JavaScript that will then apply those style changes. So when your browser is loading and going through these steps of the Cascade Layout Pane Composite after it's read the DOM and the CSS Object Model, it'll go through all those steps, and then it'll read the JavaScript on your main thread that then reapplies those changes. So it's not very efficient. A lot of what Houdini does is it gives browsers more efficiency when relating to style code. Not only does it do that, but it gives us developers access to the CSS object model for the very first time. So now we can tell the browser how we want it to read our CSS code in that CSS step when it's reading the CSS for the first time. So it doesn't have to go through this process and then go through it again. It can just go through it one time. And it applies those style changes at the CSS object model level. So it's super cool in that respect because this is something that we didn't have in our toolkit before. It allows us to write CSS polyfills. So not just JavaScript polyfills that layer on top of your page, but real style polyfills that the browser understands as CSS, that you're registering to the CSS interface in your browser. It allows for the browser to be more performant in the way that you're reading that code and using that code, as I showed you earlier. And it also allows for you as a development to build faster and to have more power. This is an excellent illustration. I love dogs, by the way. If you want to talk to me about dogs, come find me after. So in this illustration, this big dog is browsers, the W3C standards bodies who are figuring out the right ways to implement things for the browser. And this small dog is you using Houdini, finding your own path, and implementing things. Because if you have something in your tool set, in your application, that doesn't exist on the web today in terms of visual style or layout or animation, you don't have to wait for the browser to implement that feature. You can implement it yourself. And then you can make it a CSS polyfill, open source it, have the community use it. It's really cool. Did I say more power? I sure did. Houdini's super cool. So 2 years ago, on this very stage, I found this tweet. And it was Sarah Drasner, who's speaking later today, saying, quoting Sam Richard, who spoke about Houdini 2 years ago. And as you could see, he said, is Houdini ready yet? The answer is unequivocally no. And we see all of this red in there. But I'm happy to say that things are looking up and things have gotten better. So I know that you still see a lot of red here. However, I do want to note that in the Microsoft Edge section, once their WebKit-based browser comes out, it's going to look exactly like this first section. And I've tried all these demos on Edge, and they do work on the new Edge. So it's pretty cool how fast this is now changing. If you're interested in this technology, there's this excellent website called ishoudinireadyyet.com, which is where Sam was posing that question from 2 years ago, and it tracks all of the different layouts, because Houdini is sort of this umbrella term for a variety of browser APIs. So it tracks which browsers have an intent to implement, what their current progress is, whether it's shipped, whether it's in progress, in development, if it's intended. Then there's also the W3C spec. So as you can see, there's a lot of different parts that are involved. There's the layout API, the paint API, the parser API has no signal, so ignore that for now. Properties and values API, there's the animation worklet, the typed object model, and font metrics API. And because in this talk I want to focus on what we can do today, I'm going to primarily be focusing on the typed object model, and I'm going to be focusing on paint and properties and values because they work in Chrome stable, which is pretty cool. So let's start with the typed object model. The typed OM allows for faster and more semantic CSS parsing. Right now, when the browser is reading the CSS, it does this like string-based regex magic, where it goes through and it looks for all of these individual characters to make some meaning out of those characters. It looks for a dot signifying a class or an ID, or maybe there's nothing there because it's just a base element. It's looking for a string, and then it'll stop that search when it gets to that open curly brace. It's looking for a property at that point. Then it's looking for a colon to separate the property and the value, and then that value has to have an adjacent unit that matches with that value, and then that line gets searched through until you see that semicolon. So you have to do this every single time and make sure all these things make sense. And that's slow. But with the typed object model, we have structured data and computed value. So there's more semantic meaning to CSS. It's this object-like syntax of a CSS unit value. And so what does that look like? Here's an example of a box. I just have a couple of styles on it, a width and height, and a background color of hot pink. And then in the console here, I'm logging the height and the opacity. And so I'm doing that with computedStyleMap.get. You can also set values, so I can do computedStyleMap.set, and then it'll run this, and it'll update those values. I think the best way to actually look at this is in DevTools, so you can kind of see what's going on behind the scenes there. So I'm going to open up the console. I have this on my clipboard as the box, so just $0 gets me that object, that element. And then I'm going to do .computedStyleMap.get, and here I have it set up height. And so you can see here that it's not just a string value, you're actually getting units returned, you're getting this object returned from the browser. So this is in Chrome stable, this is how the browser can now render CSS in a more semantic and faster way. And that leads me to the properties and values API. Who here has heard of CSS variables or uses CSS variables? Yeah, a lot of us. CSS variables are super cool. They allow for dynamic variables in CSS. It's not just static variables, it's variables that can actually be updated in JavaScript, propagate throughout your entire application, can be directly affected, let you separate logic and styling. Really important to have CSS variables. But custom properties, registered custom properties in Houdini are going to give those variables superpowers and let us do so much more. So with custom properties, you can set up a name and a value. That's current custom properties, CSS variables. With registered custom properties, we can set up that name, value, but also a syntax, an initial value definition so it can fall back, and you can set up if it inherits from its parent or not. So it's like a CSS variable plus plus. And that allows us to do a lot of great things that we currently can't do on the web. One example of that is animated gradients. Here I have this box. I have a background on it, which is linear gradient that's going from red, this color, to blue. I'm updating this color value. I'm trying to transition it with this transition here, but when you hover it, you see that there's not actually a transition duration of 1 second, and that's because the web right now can't animate gradients. But if we register a property, so this property I'm calling color stop, you can call it anything. You can give it any name. I give it a syntax, so it has some kind of semantic meaning. Then I can register this and update my CSS code to actually read from color stop instead of color. And so here I'm going to update in the background, I'm going to update it in the transition, I'm going to update it in the hover. And when I run this, it's now using this registered property. So when I hover it, it actually understands that it's a color and you can transition colors. They're interoperable. So it allows us to do things like this that we previously couldn't. The current syntaxes for custom properties are length, number, percentage, color, image, URL, integer, angle, time, resolution, transform function. And if none of those worked for you, you can use a custom identifier or a custom ident, which I do in a later example here. And they're great. You can put anything you want in there. So another cool thing about custom properties is this initial value. Here in the CSS, I'm not actually setting this custom property anywhere. It's not set in the root. There's nothing I'm pulling in. It's not set inside of that element itself. But you see that there's color. There's color primary. And on hover, there's color secondary. So when I hover this, you can see that's transitioning. But I'm not setting it here. I can update this value. So if I wanted to update color primary to yellow and run that, it updates. So I can do that dynamically. It's not like stopping me from adjusting this value. It's not a constant value. But if I have like a falsy value here, like a number, which isn't a color, I'm still going to get a fallback. I'm not going to see a transparent white screen here. I'm going to get a fallback, and it goes back to that initial value color of blue-violet, which I've registered it as. And this is cool because it lets you prevent errors when you're writing code, when you're building CSS with big teams. It's kind of like typing your CSS variables in a very base way. And you know, TypeScript is so hot right now, so I had to include that in my slides. But it's also like creating CSS systems. It's like building systems that are more robust, that give you that error checking, that give you definitions in your code, in your CSS code. And we know that design systems are also so hot right now, so this must be a very popular talk, right? The future syntax for this is not going to require you to write this in a separate JavaScript file and register it. It's going to all be in CSS, and that looks like this. You'll be able to use the @property syntax, and so @property, you give it that name, so this is color primary, and then you put all that information in a registration like this that's inside of your CSS along with the rest of your code. You could import that. A really common practice is to have your theming in a separate file that you're importing globally. But it looks like this. It's obviously not going to work because it's not currently working I'm working in Chrome Stable here. But it'll look a lot nicer than having a separate file they have to register. If you want to use that syntax now, you can. Vitaly Bobrov created post-CSS register custom props as a post-CSS plugin. What this does is it reads through your CSS code, and then it applies the changes. It pulls out those registrations and puts them into a separate JavaScript file that is then registering with your code. So you can have the developer experience of using that syntax, but get the custom properties to work the way that you want them to. But what about using these now in browsers? You will remember that not every browser has supported Houdini yet, and it's very much an emerging technology that, while it has come a long way, is not fully supported and definitely doesn't work in every browser. Custom properties are something that's pretty well supported. It doesn't work in IE 11, but works in all of the evergreen browsers today. So you can use custom properties for fallback values. You can use those to set the root and then override those. But that's because the cascade is great. You can also update those inside of your elements. I think that this is something that people are definitely using today and can use in the future. And so that kind of works like this. I have these set in the root. I have color primary and color secondary. Again, I can just set color primary to, let's say, red this time. Run that. That updates. If I do set this to a falsy value, something that's not from the color syntax, it is going to ignore that line of code because that's what CSS does. Instead of erroring out, it just ignores. So you see that there's a transition from nothing, from transparent to pink, since it doesn't have a fallback value. So that just showcases the power of Houdini. So things that we can't polyfill today are syntax, initial value, that fallback value, and inheritance, specifying if it inherits from its parent or not. But I'm excited for that new syntax. And this leads me to speaking about the paint worklet, which is one of the things I'm most excited about because it is pretty well supported in terms of Houdini worklets. So everything is on a scale, right? But the paint worklet is definitely something that you can play with today and see how it works in various browsers. It does work in Chrome. I'm using Chrome in this presentation. So if you've heard of web workers or service workers as an example of that, They basically allow for you to set some parameters and register a worklet to that page so that that worklet can do some work for you when you don't have access to a network, for example. You can cache for offline. You can pre-render assets. It's kind of like preparing a web page for you. You can do push notifications and a lot of other cool things. So the reason that that happens is because this service worker or worklet lives between the web page and your network. So when you visit it, if you're online, you go to the network. If you're offline, whatever you've registered as cache or other things in that service worker gets sent to that website. So worklets in Houdini work in a similar way, where they live off of the main thread. You have to register them. They have to be developed in either HTTPS or localhost because of this, because they don't live inside of the page themselves. But it's a similar concept, except now we're moving that concept from just JavaScript code into style code. And it's still JavaScript, but it's about the presentation of the page. If you want to write a worklet, there's a few steps. In JavaScript, you would write and register the worklet definition. So here I'm using a class to show you that you do register paint or layout, animation, whatever other worklet that you want to use here. You give it a name. I called it fun. And then I'm pulling the class in there, but you can just write the whole thing inside of there. Then inside of HTML, you need to add it to the CSS interface. So you invoke the worklet file with css.paintworklet.addModule, my painter. And then in CSS, you would use the worklet by the name that you gave it when you registered it. So is this JavaScript in CSS? Yes, it is. It all comes full circle. So here's an example of a little demo that I did where I just was painting squares from the top left to the bottom right corner, and I'm just using an array of RGB values to build that from this blue to eventually this the yellow to the blue in this element, and it depends on the size of the div. And so it's basically a canvas syntax. It's very similar to canvas, and you have parameters that you pull in, the context and the size, which I can then use to apply these transformations. So once I've written that, I can go into my HTML and create css.paintwork.addModule, and I'm adding the rainbow ties module. And then in CSS, I can use it with one line of code. So here I've used it as a background image, where I set background, paint, rainbow ties. If I'm doing an animation or layout worklet, I would say layout, and then whatever name I gave it there. So it's pretty straightforward usage. There is a bit that goes more into it in the back end of the front end, which is writing this worklet. But as an end user, you can just set background image, paint rainbow ties. And it doesn't only have to be a background. You can use this as a, here we have a border. So here's a border image and a border. You can just start playing around with this. It's the same exact worklet, but I'm just using it in a different way. And what I love about the web is how creative you can get with it. So if I wanted to, I can create like a pseudo element here. Maybe, well, we have to give it content so that it appears. We want to position it absolutely. We want to then position this relatively so it lives inside of its parent and not outside of that to the page. So then we want to give it a position of top 0, left 0. We have to give it a display, so we'll do display block. We'll have this be a width and a height of 100% so that it just matches the parent element in the top there. And then I want to copy the same border, so we have 2 of the same borders sort of appearing here. I'm going to paste that in and then run this. So now we have these 2 borders, and you can start to get more experimental with this. I want this to maybe overlap so it shows some kind of interaction between those, and since that border is 1 rem, I'll make it a negative a half of a rem. I love blend modes on the web, so let's do a mixed blend mode of screen, and here you'll start to see some interaction between those. So we see that there's like up here inside of that, and then, you know, why stop there? Because there's filters on the web, and filters are super cool, so you can do like a hue rotate, maybe 180 degrees to get some more color variance in there, and then I can run that. And now we have, just like on the screen, some cool pixelated 90s shit, and that's super trendy, and you can just start playing and mixing existing CSS with Houdini and worklets in a decorative way, and it's like magic. You can make anything happen because you can use your existing skills in properties that are currently implemented in the browser and mix those with things that don't currently exist in the browser. So when you're building design systems, this is a great approach. It also lets you to use polyfills in a way that is coming from the CSS angle. On the web, we don't currently have these conic gradients fully supported. They're only supported in Chrome. But once all these browsers have implemented Houdini, you'll be able to create these polyfills. So what we're doing here is we could even pull in other libraries. There's Tiny Color. We're using Leah Veroux's conical gradient polyfill. And then you can here not only have context and size or geometry, but you can also get input properties and arguments. So in the style here, in the CSS, I'm using this paint conic gradient, but I'm also setting these additional values. If I wanted this to be a full circle and have it go all the way around, then I would run that. I'd have it start and end with the same color value. So today, in the browser, Houdini lets us use arguments, lets us create functions inside of our CSS. And with that future syntax, when we'll be able to register this all in the same place, you won't even have to use that paint and then specify the name. You'll be able to say background, the name of that variable, which would be conic gradients, and then put the arguments inside of that. So I think it's pretty cool stuff, personally. You can also animate these things. An example of animating them is this little sparkles example, where I'm just basically, well, I'm getting an input property called sparkle number, and then that's the number of sparkles here. I'm setting a size, width, height, color, and then I'm just drawing out these sparkles in this element. In the CSS, I have an animation here. So I have paint sparkles as the background, and this animation is going from 30 to 40 sparkles. So it's going every half a second from 30 to 40. And I can make this bigger if I want more sparkles, so I can make it like 300 to 400 sparkles. The thing is, this world is your oyster. The world of Houdini is your oyster. So if I do 3 to 4, it's just a little bit of sparkle. You know, you don't want to be too extra, just a little extra. And a really cool demo that I saw comes from IMVDO, who creates CSS-Houdini.rocks. Awesome resource with a lot of really cool demos of Houdini in action. So he wrote a worklet that basically just evaluates any custom property called background canvas. That's all it's doing here. You're evaluating something that you're converting to a string. I thought that was super clever, because what this allows you to do is to write those worklets inside of your CSS underneath that element. So here we have a background canvas, which is that rainbow ties function. And then I'm just setting background, paint background canvas. I'm using that worklet, the one evaluation worklet. Here I have a sparkles element where I'm writing all of this code just inside of the CSS. It looks super messy, honestly, but then I'm using that same evaluation function. If you are doing this, you have to be really careful with your semicolons, because it is converting it all to a string first, and it's probably not like a long-term use case, but it just showcases the power of worklets and of doing this kind of development in your browser. It really allows you to extend the web. So I want to take this example back to something that is more practical, something like material design. Material is an open source design system that helps teams build high-quality digital experiences. And a part of that is a highly themable library of components for the web called MDC Web. Within Material, this platform supports Android, iOS, Flutter, and web. So there are a lot of different considerations involved. And there are these theming studies that my team has done to sort of figure out how we can best support multiple views, multiple themes within the same base. So you could use the same code base, but style this for a wide variety of teams and use cases and needs. And so within that comes typography, color, and shape. And one of those demos is this Shrine app. This is one of the case studies that my team has created, where they're using this angled shape on the top left to bring your attention up to that menu bar, and this angled shape on the bottom right, where this cart is, as a unifying factor within this brand. This brand is Shrine. It's like sharp edges. It's not super rounded and bubbly. But with shape on the web, rounded corners, cool. We got those. Cut corners, we don't got those. We don't have them. And it's a shame, because this conversation actually started in 2012 when Fantasai and Leah Veroux did a lot of great work in the W3C trying to get corner shape implemented in browsers, and it never got implemented. I was at a CSS working group meeting where we actually simplified the spec to just being rounded and angled corners to hopefully get browsers to implement it. It's a little bit less complex when you only have two options here, because this is the majority use case for arrows and other things. But it's still not something that exists in the browsers today, nor will it probably soon, unfortunately. But within our material spec, the web is the only platform that doesn't have cut corners. So I thought, okay, I want to take this button, and I want to make it look like this. I want to make it look like that Shrine app. Why does the web not have nice things? So I started writing a worklet, and here I was using background. I have a corner radius that's adjustable, a paint color. There's different styles of buttons in material. There's outline button, and there's also a filled button. There's raised buttons. There's a few different buttons, so you had to have different paint styles available. And so these are all custom properties that I'm using here, and then throwing into this worklet called Notched Corners and drawing it in. So that all worked well and good until I realized one other thing about material, and that is that there is this notion of reactivity to the user in the browser. We're going to hear more about animation on the web today, but this is sort of the start of that, where when you click somewhere on the page, you want to be notified as a user that click was registered. And so part of that is this ripple effect. So in material, when you click, you see this ripple based on where you clicked. You have it on both your outlined and your filled-in buttons. So when I had this as a background and you clicked in, that ripple would extend past where that angle was, because divs on the web are squares by default. We aren't getting that really, truly cut corner, and that's why we need that property. But we have masking on the web. And masks are really cool because you can animate them. They're interoperable. You can use a variety of mediums like PNG, JPEG, or SVG. And you can also use a Houdini worklet, because Houdini worklet basically draws a canvas, which then you could put into your CSS code. One thing to note here is that borders, shadows, and other styles that are outside of this mask will be hidden because you are telling your browser that you don't want to see anything outside of that mask. So to recreate these buttons, I ended up having to use a combination of masking and painting using the same worklet. The only HTML I had to adjust was for the shadow container, so this shadowed button here, and that was because the mask that was necessary for the ripple to work with the angle was cutting off the shadow, so we had to add a shadow container. But basically, we're getting input properties and arguments. That's where this custom identifier comes in, because when I'm writing this code, I want to be able to specify fill modes. For every single button here, we want to mask it. We're using that angled corners worklet as a fill mode, so we fill it and then mask it. But then for the outline button, we want to use the outlined mode. So here I'm using the same worklet as a border image, but I'm outlining it. I'm painting it in there, as well as masking that element. So you can use these and mix them and build on top of each other to get things that work in real life. It's not just sort of this floofy thing. It's something that actually lets our UIs be consistent across platforms. And I know the big question in everyone's mind is, but what does it look like in IE11? Let's find out. So, all right, let's find out. I'm going to open this cross-browser testing here. I have nothing on my desktop, but here we go. All right, let's run this test. I'm running it Windows 10, IE11. I made a little CodePen demo. So this is going to run and start this test. Oh, okay, gotta do that. I'm not a robot. Where's all the crosswalks? Click through here. Will you let me see? ReCAPTCHA. Whoa, it assumed I was a robot. It stopped. All right, let's try this one more time. All right, I'm not a robot. Great, crosswalks. 1, 2, 3. Oh, okay, good. That was an easy one. Usually they fade out and everything. Anyway, here's the button. That's the material button that has the regular styles. And then here's the angled button. So that's the exact same code that we saw earlier. And it doesn't look broken. It looks fine. You're not getting that angle, but you don't have to have the same exact experience on every browser. You have to have a good user experience on every browser, but it doesn't have to be identical. Even the buttons here, the ripple isn't something that you see on IE11, but you get some kind of feedback response. So I think that it's okay. I think that this is something that we can definitely use now and progressively enhance it to browsers that don't have this kind of support. So in case that didn't work, here's an image. Here's a visual. So why stop there? We can combine all these things. We can use rainbow types. We can use the angles. We can do anything our heart desires. And you can start to play with these things and build on them and mix them. And so here's just combining a few of the examples I showed in this presentation. And that's what brings me to a little project I call extra.css that I've been working on. And this is a CSS Houdini paint library for making your site a little more #extra, because who doesn't need that in their life? So there's a few different demos here. We have the sparkles. You could change the hue. You can make it whatever color you want. The number of sparkles, you could update the variance of the width and the height, so you could change the size of those sparkles to make it work for your UI. You could change the weight of the sparkles there too. You can do little scallops. So if you want to do like a little scallop around your text, you could change the radius of this, make it bigger or smaller, the weight of that. We have super underline because, why have one underline when you can have 19 underlines? I don't know, why not? This could be a part of your brand. Use it, love it. You could change the spread from the top to being further away from your element there. You could do a cross out. This was really popular, this cross out hipster branding not too long ago. And then confetti, because yay, who doesn't love confetti? You can tell that I just like doing this with the sliders. So the coolest thing about this library is its ease of use, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier for the end user of this Houdini worklet. So the way that you use it is you need to include this one line of code, because I'm using a CDN, love unpackage the CDN, where you're including unpackage.com/extra.css, the name of the library, and then the name of this, which is crossout.js, that's the name of that specific worklet. So once we've included that in our HTML and our CSS, all we have to do is include one line of code, background, paint, extra crossout, the name of the worklet. You can optionally set parameters to override the parameters that I have as a default, but in 2 lines of code, you can make web magic happen that before wasn't possible and works for your system, and then use it across your whole website. So if you want to play with Houdini, if you've been wanting to get your hands dirty, this is a great place to contribute. Love to see your PRs, love to see your creativity on the web, especially if you're really into Canvas, then you have a lot of experience and control on things that you can do within Houdini. Houdini is really cool to me because it democratizes native web styling. It means that anyone can have access to the browser engine in terms of CSS, which was not something that we had before. But an important thing to note is that this doesn't mean that web standards are finished evolving. The answer can't just be, oh, build it in Houdini. This has to be us as developers paving the cow paths for what we want to see the browser put in as a web standard. And with great power comes great responsibility. So if you are going to use Houdini today, here's the couple of rules, them rules. The first one is to check support. The way to check it in CSS is using @support, so you can use background paint to check if there's support there, or layout or animation. Note that IE11 doesn't support @supports, ironically, so you'll want to put your Houdini code inside of the @supports and your fallback outside of it. For JavaScript, you can check if type of register paint is not equal to undefined, and then put your code in there, because unlike CSS, JavaScript will break when there's something that it can't read, or it can create errors that'll mess up your whole application, and you don't want to do that for some styling thing. So make sure that you're checking support with JavaScript. And then test in browsers. Test using online testing tools like I was showing earlier, test in real life, but also test mobile browsers. Don't forget about the mobile web. That's a large use case, so make sure that you're testing not just desktop, but also mobile browsers. And keep it decorative. A good way to make sure that you're not ruining your application is to make sure this is just used for flourishes for now, especially while it's in progress. Don't obfuscate content. That's a good $5 word. Don't cover up your content or make it illegible to some people. Definitely do some browser testing. And don't reorder the DOM. This is specifically relating to the layout worklet, where you can create randomized layout if you want. The DOM structure is the same, but the layout of your page is completely different, and that'll ruin a user's experience if they're using a screen reader or some kind of assistive device for moving around the screen, or even just using keyboard navigation. That's going to make it really difficult. So if you're using Houdini today, the house rules are check support, test browsers, and keep it decorative. It's a really exciting time, I think, to be a web developer, because the web is so creative. It's this creative medium that allows us to express real applications and data itself is creative as this parameter that we have to live within, this world that we have to live within on the web. And we're seeing a lot of really interesting websites, and like brutalism coming back on the web, and like big flashy colors, and 90s is trendy in real life and on the web, and it's cool to see that happen. So if you're going to be creative on the web, if you're going to use these technologies, create responsibly, think about all of the different users that you have, the different abilities of your users, and thank you so much for your time.